You know how when you draw those diagrams with rectangles and rhomboids and circles, and then you connect them all with arrows, and that turns up to be some type of flow in human processes or something like that? That's what pipelines are.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 160. I'm new to CI/CD. Where do I start? Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick.
I was on Reddit the other day. Boy, that's a scary place to be. One of the questions that I saw that was interesting, that I figured we would talk about today, was I'm new to CI/CD. Where do I start? I have an idea. Run as far away as possible. Where should you start?
I know where you should end.
Oh.
Can I say where you should end?
Well, it's usually good to know the end from the beginning. So yes, where should we end?
You should end with CI/CD pipelines, meaning you shouldn't start there. Start by having a command to perform logical groups of operations. Build.sh, test.sh, deploy.sh, and so on and so forth. That's where you start. And if you do that right, then you will be more productive. You will be able to build and test and so on and so forth manually. And here's the trick. CI/CD does not mean that you will never run those things manually again. Actually, you will probably continue always doing those types of tasks mostly manually, no matter how advanced you are. Always. And that's a good sign. That's a sign that somebody, while developing, is using those helper scripts. Because while I'm developing, I need to do most of the CI/CD pipeline. Not literally everything, just to clarify. Not going to production, but all types of tasks. Most of types of tasks that pipelines are doing, I need to do manually while developing. Or maybe I have some kind of tool like Scaffold or Tilt or whatnot that is doing that for me, but still I need those commands. I cannot imagine myself writing code of something without building it locally or deploying it locally or some remote development environment. So I need those things with or without pipelines.
And what you're alluding to is those scripts become steps within the pipeline over time.
Once I have those scripts, and I'm calling them scripts, it can be, doesn't have to be literally script. It can be written in Go, in Java, I don't care. Executables, let's put it that way. Yeah, pipelines. Pipelines are just the last mile, easy. Now I'm diminishing, it sounds like I'm diminishing the value of pipelines. I'm not. I actually think that actually surfaces the real value of pipelines, being able to coordinate and schedule and execute all the automation that is floating around.
That's where people tend to get confused a lot, is they think the CI/CD pipeline has to be its own little program, and it's not. It's loosely coupled coordination of things you are already doing by hand.
Exactly. It's very easy when you say that way, right?
I mean, it doesn't mean that it doesn't get complex, but
it does.
By the time you add in, okay, I've got to build for Linux and Mac and Windows, and I need to test 18 different versions of browsers, and I need to, but you were doing each of those things manually anyway. We're just trying to automate that within whatever pipeline, and I'm air quoting pipeline right now, whether that's you're doing something in Jenkins, maybe you're doing something in GitHub Actions, doesn't really matter. You're just coordinating those things and having them run in a sequence that you prefer.
What you just said, testing in browsers, I think that's an amazingly good example of what we spoke so far. I cannot imagine me not testing a browser-based application, not testing it locally to some extent. I'm not saying deep everything, but to some extent. I'm going to open a browser and at least press the refresh key, right? What I'm going to do in pipelines is then do the same thing just on 20 different browsers, because I'm not going to test it on all the browsers locally, right? I just want to make sure that actually does work somehow in my Chrome or whatever I'm using. So it's the same task, right? Me running locally and me running in pipelines, except that in pipelines, that same task coordinated so that, okay, now let me run 20 instances of that, what you're running manually, let me do it 20 times with different parameters and in parallel so that I actually do 5 versions of each browser, right? That's that coordination of the things that could run locally, that are running locally, but on a different scale and differently connected with other tasks that you might have.
Because if you think about what you were saying earlier, you had your build SH, your test SH, your deploy SH. That's a fairly logical understanding. I think that's probably one thing to understand too, is we talked about at the end, is this quote unquote pipeline. Don't get stuck with that word pipeline as it's a physical implementation. It is, but it isn't. Understanding the logical pipeline is more important than the physical pipeline. The implementation of that logical pipeline. I mean, we can get into a lot of arguments about that, I guess, but you need to understand the bits and pieces as they move through. So we talked about what the end is. What's the beginning?
That first script you're going to write, I honestly don't care whether I don't have a strong opinion whether that should be building or testing or deploying or what it should, right?
I've got one better than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually before even the build. Do all of the tools that I'm going to need in this process exist?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's an assumption that some people make, and when you get down to the end and it's like, wait, I don't have Maven version 336 or 363 or whatever that number was, because that's what I have on my machine. You have to think a little bit ahead and validate that, okay, are all the tools here that I need? Is all the potential data here that I need? And understanding it's that measure twice, cut once type scenario. Yes, that might take you an extra few seconds, but I would rather know that up front than to get halfway down that pipe and then find that, oh, this tool was never installed. I mean, we're talking, physical implementations here and not containerized, and you could pull things on the fly. I'm talking about, I've got a static type worker, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you want to know how I know that? Because that happens to me on a number of things, or, some links get busted. So the very first thing that I do in any pipe that I write is, are all the tools here that I know that I'm going to be using? And if they're not, guess what? It fails really fast. And I'm okay with that. It's like, oh, if I forgot to add that in. Great. That actually happened to me recently. I was going through and processing something. It's like, oh, wait, we use Hugo for our static site generator. And one of the pipelines that I use for processing this podcast is I generate a page for Hugo. Well, my Hugo link got busted. And that was a check that I did not have. So I'd run through all the pipe, and I get down to the Hugo stuff is the last big stage of the pipe, and it blows up. So now I have to go off and deal with manually generating the last few steps. But here's the deal, going back to what you were saying. I already had a script that was just calling Hugo. So all I had to do was go back and run that script, pass in a couple of parameters to it. It wasn't a big deal, but it was an annoyance. But what was the thing I did right afterwards? I updated my pipeline to check for the validation of Hugo. And I already had my validation for everything else. I had just forgotten to add Hugo in.
So if I understood right, you have a problem in the pipeline, and then you went back to your terminal, to local, fixed the problem, and validated that you fixed the problem. And then you moved back to the pipeline.
Now put that check back into the pipeline of, okay, make sure that exists. Otherwise, fail out.
Which brings us to a question that I at least am getting or was getting very, very frequently. That's how do I test my pipelines? which I think gets exactly the same answer as the previous answers we were getting, right? You don't. I mean, you do, but only whether the pipeline is doing orchestration right. You know that the script is doing whatever it's supposed to be doing.
When people take whatever implementation it is, again, Jenkins, GitHub Actions, doesn't matter, and they turn that into an application project itself, instead of just loosely coupling and calling out quote unquote scripts, binaries, whatever. Much like the scenario I just talked about. The test for me now at the front is, are all the tools here that I need before I even consider moving on down the pipe? If not, I stop. That's my test. Because if all the tools are here, I expect it to work. Now, if I have a transient network issue or any of those other kinds of things, okay, those things happen. Those are called flaky tests or flaky whatevers. But if I know I've got everything that I need, my confidence level is high. What else should people need to start with? What should they start? Should they read? Let's break this out. Should they actually read a book? I have a book in mind. That's the reason why. Should they read Phoenix Project? If they've never read Phoenix Project, should they read Phoenix Project?
I was about to say the same. I wasn't about to mention Phoenix, but I think, yes, they should read the book, but more about what it's really all about, not necessarily how tool X works.
Right. Actually, a really good one, and we're recording this in, I don't even know when it is right now, April of 2022. This is coming out in May of 2022. Dave Farley has recently self-published a book. He did this big engineering one as well, software engineering one. That's not the one I'm talking about. But he published a book on pipeline, and it's on leanpub.com. So if you go to leanpub.com, look up Dave Farley, you'll find the book. I don't have the name of it right here in front of me. That's probably one of the best overviews that I have read in a long time. It was nothing new, but if you're just coming into that book gives you a good understanding of the full pipe, of what you should consider in your full pipe. The other thing, if you're just getting started, is I can guarantee you, no matter the number of books that you read, there's going to be stuff that you have to implement in a pipe that you don't know anything about, because you're going to get blindsided by security, by audit, by these other things that you're thinking, well, I'm just trying to build an image. What else matters? Trust me, in large organizations or organizations that have to pass SOC 2 audits or other types of compliance type levels, there's going to be a lot of stuff that you're going to need to implement that have nothing to do with the actual application development.
But also, and this is where I differ sometimes with companies and teams I speak with, also nothing to do with pipes.
Correct.
Right? Because from pipe perspective, whether you're passing audit, it's all about ensuring that audit is executed. But audit itself is not part of pipeline. I mean, it is part of pipeline. It is
this. Okay, let's hold there for just a second, because we keep going back on ourselves. It's like it's part of the pipeline. It's not part of the pipeline, right? You're saying it. I'm saying it too.
It is executed by a pipeline.
Yes.
But audit is a process that exists and is executable independently of a pipeline. And I'm using audit as example here exclusively, right? So I don't know what that means, right? Audit can be many things. It could mean, hey, we are shipping logs somewhere. It could be we are scanning this something, and so on and so forth. Whatever that is, it exists, and it has its own life that is completely independent of pipelines. So from that perspective, it is not related directly with pipelines. What is related with pipelines? Hey, actually, before something goes to production or whatever the criteria is, we need to make sure that audit process is executed. And doesn't have to be pipeline, but very often is pipeline. So that's the type of decoupling I'm referring to, right? I have a process, whatever that process is. Auditing is, from that perspective, is not different than building or testing, right? This is how I do X, this is how I do Y, this is how I do Z. And I have this pipeline that is make sure that X is executed first, and then Y and Z are executed in parallel only if A is successful. That's a pipeline. That's the type of logic that pipelines are helping us with, right? which is basically orchestration. What is executed when, and how does execution of one thing influence the execution of another? I might be skipping execution of something because the result of something else is something or something else. That's the logic. So I see pipelines like similar to, you know how when you draw those diagrams with rectangles and rhomboids and circles, and then you connect them all with arrows, and that turns up to be some type of flow in human processes or something like that. That's what pipelines are. In that hypothetical diagram, when you say audit, it's not really that audit is happening in the diagram. Diagram is just representing that audit should happen here. And that's what pipelines do as well. This is the moment when you audit something.
Because you can't audit before this point, and you shouldn't audit after this point because it would be too late.
Exactly. You cannot audit something that doesn't exist, so you need to build it first, as an example. Or clone the code if you're auditing code, right? And you cannot audit after it's deployed to production because that would be silly. So yes, there is the flow. Maybe pipelines should be called flows.
And it is in some places. But the thing you're really talking about right now is release orchestration. Right? When we're talking about this whole thing, we're bringing in audit and all these other things. The point I want to try to make here is if you think about the physical implementation of a pipeline, there is probably not going to be, and hopefully there isn't just a single pipeline to do all the things.
No, there are many pipelines.
There should be many physical implementations of whatever that is. And then there is probably over the top of that, an overarching pipeline that is not necessarily triggering each of those pipelines, but is helping move those things through. That's the release orchestration part of things. That gives you that full, true end-to-end pipeline. But you don't want to, trust me, you do not, let me say it one more time, you do not want to implement that in a single physical pipeline. Because as soon as you have to make one change, guess what? Your life is going to become miserable. Oh, by the way, if you do decide to implement it as a single physical pipeline, and you've also decided that everything must run through that pipeline within your organization, things are not going to be good for you. Again, because when you make that one change that shouldn't affect anybody, or it's only going to affect this one team, guess what? It's going to affect everybody else too. Again, we're talking about loosely coupled within a physical pipeline, going back to our build, test, deploy SHs, right? Nice loosely coupled. We orchestrate those things together in a single physical pipeline. But then maybe we have an overarching that's going to be checking the output of that run to determine, okay, what do I do with that? Because that deploy was actually just pushing that artifact, container image, jar file, whatever, into a repository of some sort. And then there's another sequence of events that happens to whatever happens after you push an image in. Are you auto-deploying, doing a preview environment? Are you whatever it is? Again, the endpoint is a CI/CD pipeline. But the problem is, what is that CI/CD pipeline? Is it now a release orchestration pipeline, or is it just my scope is my only responsibility is get it pushed to Artifactory, and I'm done. But I can guarantee you that pushing something to Artifactory, it's not done because it's not running. Somebody else is going to pick it up and move it from there, whether that somebody else is you or another person.
I've been trying to retrain my brain not to use much terms like, let's say, release orchestration, mostly because in my head that's part of a pipeline or a process or whatever we want to call, right? There are many different types of processes that are executed as a result of doing something. Pushing something to Git can execute one pipeline or another pipeline or 5 pipelines, depending on which repo I push to, whether it's mainline or some other branch, whether it's pull request, and so on and so forth, right? Release orchestration is just one of many use cases.
I'm glad you're calling this out because that's true. It is a specific implementation detail of a type of pipeline. So you do agree that release orchestration is an implementation, right?
Yes.
That is true, right?
It's a flavor of pipeline or whatever the right expression would be. It's
right. So what's the higher level? So what is the parent to that, if you will?
I'm calling it pipelines.
Just a pipeline in general. Just a pipeline.
Pipeline until I find better. I'm intentionally not calling it anymore CI/CD because, again, pipeline can serve many different purposes. CI being one of them, even though CD being another, release orchestration being third, creating preview environments being fourth, I don't know, creating a cluster being fifth, and so on and so forth, right? So I can come up with many, many different scenarios, and I tend to call them all pipelines, mostly because I don't have better terms. I just have worse terms. I'm not calling it CI/CD anymore, for example.
Yeah, I agree. I think everybody's coming up with worse terms now. When somebody's starting out, we talked about just creating those simple shell scripts or whatever they want to do. It doesn't really matter what it is.
Or complex. They don't have to be simple. Actually, there is even more benefits when those are complex, because the more complex they are, the less reasons for you to have them in pipelines instead of in scripts or some binaries or whatever.
Correct, because we don't want business logic baked into the pipeline implementation, whether that's a Jenkins file, a GitHub action, or a workflow YAML or whatever those are. We don't want the smarts there. We want the smarts. This goes back to your testing point. We don't want the smarts buried in those implementations. We want the smarts in whatever the thing is, because I can test that. I wrote that in Go, Java, Python. I don't care what it is, because I used a real programming language to create that thing. So I can use the real testing around that language to do real testing.
And I can run it independently of pipelines. That's probably the most important thing. I can run it myself.
And you can run it without being tied to a specific tool. And if you decided, we talked about in the previous episode, people jumping from cloud to cloud to cloud. Most people actually don't do that. I think opposite to that, not to the same extent, people will move from CI tool to CI tool to CI tool, or there will be multiple CI tools. I'm using CI tool in a very normal industry way. Jenkins, GitHub Actions, fill in the blank. If I have this thing that I wrote that's complex, that does the thing that I want, I can use that in Jenkins via an SH step. I can use it in GitHub Actions via I can't remember whatever that step is called, right? I've created my business logic in a self-contained way, and I can reuse that anywhere else.
And distribute it.
And distribute it. Yeah. That's huge, huge, huge. So I guess one of the unlearnings is you need to understand what tool that you're using and understand how to use it. But you need to think in a way that, how can I get to the command line within this tool as quickly as possible? Right? Use the tool for what it's good for. If it's got, in Jenkins, you got plugin architecture. In GitHub Actions, you have reusable workflows and other things that you can, whatever, right? There's lots of things you can do, or just actions, if you will. But you want to get to whatever that base thing is so you can call your thing that you have fully tested and you know that it just works. And based on the status output from your command, is it a 0 or a non-zero? Then you know that you can move on to the next thing, because all the tools play nicely with status codes.
Exactly. The only thing that I would add is that now when I think about it, it does not necessarily have to be a tool that you fully run locally from terminal, let's say. For all I care, it could be also a service. You can say, hey, this thing, testing in a browser, is a service that we have. And the tool in that case wouldn't be test.sh, it would be curl or curl call to that something that will, because this something is not actually, we're never going to run it locally, let's say, for this reason or that. It's always going to be remote. But still, yes, then you create a service, right? That you invoke through CLI or whichever way you want. But then the story is exactly the same. You're invoking that something. Maybe actually that would be a better expression. I need to be able to invoke that something from my terminal, from a pipeline, or from potentially any other place. And I should be able to invoke that something with among many other things, as a command line. No, not many other things. Primarily, first of all, from a command line. Now, whether that's test.sh or curl or any other way that would enable me to do it from as a single command depends from organizational needs.
I would not, going back to executing a command, whatever that command is, I don't want it to do necessarily everything. I want it to do whatever that thing it needs to do is.
Oh, yeah.
Don't try to implement the quote-unquote pipeline within that single binary.
Oh, yeah, that would be like kind of release.sh. And in this context, by release, I don't mean create a tag, the script that creates a tag, but release.sh that would build it and run tests and security scan and do everything, right? Then you're actually making a mistake of not using pipelines. So there is a mistake that people are using pipelines for things that they shouldn't. Kind of, hey, how we build is written in pipeline. Wrong. But then some people do not use pipelines when they should. Kind of like, you end up with a complicated script that single script does everything. And that's very hard to do in SH or, Go or whatever, because that's where pipelines shine. They shine in actually putting all the different tasks that are executable by themselves and put them into a logical group with a logical flow and conditions and so on and so forth.
If you're trying to write your thing, if you've got a lot of conditionals in whatever it is that you're writing, meaning that binary that you've written, that script you've written, you've gone too far. That should be your first warning that I probably shouldn't be doing this. Like an example I have right now is I need to write something to make my life easier on uploading a file to a service, and the service does provide a webhook back, but I'm behind locked things, so I just need to poll. Now I'm not going to poll every second. I'll wait because I know how long the file is going to take roughly. I'll wait for a minute, and if the status still isn't complete in a minute, I'll check again in another minute. I don't care if I lose a minute, right? I'm okay with that type of polling. I'm not being aggressive. I need to write that. But what I'm not going to, and then once it's done, then I want to download the file because it's doing some processing. I don't want that little app to do anything else. I don't want that app to actually do the upload because I've already done the upload prior to that step. I could let it do that, but it doesn't need to. All I'm needing to do is, okay, it's uploaded. I just need to check the status. And once I know the status is complete, download. I want to keep it really tightly scoped.
That's the importance of having actually those steps separate in a way, right? Another example would be development. While I develop something, I need to build it locally. I'm not talking about pipelines, not talking about going to production locally. I need to build it, build an image, and then I need to deploy it. But between building an image and deploying, when I work locally, it needs to be pushed to my local Kubernetes cluster. While we're doing it for real, it needs to be pushed to a registry. I don't want to push to a registry locally because that's just a waste of time. Kind of why would my local cluster pull it from a registry I just pushed to, right? That's completely a waste, but that's extremely important when working with production, right? Having the ability to orchestrate things, same things, but with different orchestration and different variations depending on the context is extremely important. And that's why that separation is important, so that I can orchestrate it differently locally than pipelines that are eventually going maybe to production, right? And I'm using it only as an example.
So what do you think? When you first started down your CI/CD journey, where did you start? Head over to the Slack workspace. Go over to the podcast channel. You'll see a link for episode 160. Leave your comments there.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.